Let's talk about prison escape attempts, because almost everyone has seen Prison Break or Shawshank Redemption, or if you're old like me, Escape from Alcatraz, so we have an idea of what we think would work or wouldn't work or how things would happen. But I want to talk about what I saw live and in person over 19 years in prison. There was the good, the bad, the ugly. There was one strangely uplifting story, and at the end, I want to talk about my own experience with escaping from prison. So the first attempt I saw was at Nottoway Correctional Center. It was my first major prison. It was a high-level prison, and I was in the hole because I was young and dumb. I'd done something to put myself back there. And they were letting me out to rec. But when you go to rec from the hole, it's not like you go to the rec yard with other people to lift weights and play basketball. They put you in handcuffs and shackles, kind of waddle out to the cages. They lock you in the cage, they take the handcuffs off, and then you get to pace. It's a 6 foot by 2 foot or maybe 3 foot cage, but I could feel the sun on my skin, and that made it all worthwhile. So I was pacing and doing push-ups in between when I saw this officer just bolt around the corner full speed, like keys jangling. And then I heard this alarm, and they had one of those loudspeakers with the button you could press up in the tower. And then I saw more officers and lieutenants and civilian staff and everybody possible running around that corner. Now I'd seen fights, I'd seen stabbings, I'd never seen anything like this. The only thing I could figure was that there was a full-blown riot going on. But instead, it was two guys who had decided they were going to take advantage of a maintenance operation to try to make their break. Because the maintenance team had brought in the scissor lift. This is this big mechanical lift that you drive in at like 2 miles an hour, and then it can lift up to the side or even the top of the building. So while they were working behind the building, where there's this little fenced-in area, they went out the back door, they jumped on the cop, they beat him up, they took his uniform, one of them got on it, and their plan was that they were going to run over the fence, or they were going to get close enough to the fence, lift the scissor lift up, and then run into it so it would basically launch them over. This was a poorly conceived plan for a number of reasons. First of which is they were inside the initial fence around the building. It's not a big fence, but it's enough it's a little bit of a problem. Then you have to go 100 yards across the rec yard to get to the next 3 fences, and there's a guy with an AR-15 and a shotgun in the tower the whole way. They're trying, so he's just kind of like ramming it into this, and finally somebody in the tower notices this is not right, like somebody should not be hitting a fence. So he investigates, he gets his binoculars, he calls it in, all of a sudden everybody's running there. So now the guy in the officer's uniform and the guy in the regular incarcerated person's uniform were up there, and they release the attack dogs. And I've been criticized for calling them attack dogs, and I want to make it clear, I love dogs. I absolutely do. My point is the only thing I ever saw these dogs used for at Nottoway Correctional was to attack people. Often like prone or unconscious people laying on the ground whose legs and arms were mauled. So they released the dog, the guy up there had a knife, he stabbed the dog. And as someone who loves dogs, I cannot imagine hurting a dog. I also cannot imagine a dog lunging at my throat or lunging at my arm and trying to tear me to pieces. This really set the officers off, either because they love dogs themselves, or they saw this as an attack on one of their own, because they beat the living hell out of these guys. There were 2 holes at Nottoway's, under A building and under N building, and we could see the path to N building, and all we could see was a trail of blood from where they had drugged their unconscious bodies to throw them down in the hole. That was not a very successful attempt. The second attempt at Nottoway Correctional Center was actually in the honor pod, which strangely is right next to the hole where they drugged those unconscious bodies. And this was a guy who had escaped before, so he was kind of a local hero. Back 25 years before, he had escaped, and he had always promised his buddy he was going to come back for him. So after living abroad and on the run for 5 years, he came back to break his buddy out. Unfortunately, that didn't work out. He was caught and he was reincarcerated. This was 10 years, maybe 11 years later. He'd worked his way to the honor pod, and he figured out he was finally going to take his chance. I remember the thing that I noticed about him was that he was always running, and he was always doing these kind of like little acrobatic things, and he had to be in his late 50s or 60s, but apparently he was always training to be able to get away. So his plan was that at this place, you didn't get out at night. There was really no access because it was a higher level prison, but when he made it to the honor pod, they had a lot more privileges or opportunities than other people did, because it was just assumed these guys have life sentences, they're going to make the best of it, we just don't have to worry about them. So somehow he managed to get them to leave the back door unlocked, and this led to a gated area you couldn't otherwise access. If you weren't coming from inside the building, you had to have a key to get to that area, and you only had the 2 fences behind it. Normally, if it was an area where incarcerated people could be, you actually had to have 3 fences. So he was back there, he'd made these gloves out of something, God knows what, that were going to supposedly take care of the razor wire. He used blankets, he used buffer pads, he built this whole system. And he went out there, and it would have been pretty flawless, because he would have been able to get up and over and out of the way, but he picked the one moment where one of the officers from that building or from the hole was actually back in that area smoking a cigarette. So he goes, he hits the fence, he starts climbing, and this guy just kind of looks around like, what's going on? Runs over there, grabs him, calls him on the radio, holds him down until they get there, and he's down in the hole. And literally, if it weren't been for that guy having a smoking habit, he probably would have got away. And it makes you wonder, when they cut out smoking in all DOC facilities, did they make escape more likely? Well, probably not, but even so, it's just an interesting trick to the story. Now, the ugly part actually came at the next prison I was at, but weirdly, not the prison I was at. It's gonna make sense. I was at Buckingham Correctional Center, and right across the street, a few hundred yards away, was Dillwyn Correctional. They basically had no other economic opportunity in this area, so they built 2 prisons right next to each other so they would always have work for people in that area. So at Dillwyn Correctional Center, there was a guy who did successfully get away, but at pretty great cost, because he managed to hit the fences, and nobody knows exactly how or why this plan came to his mind. He did not have gloves. He did not have a system, he did not have something to defeat the razor wire, so he left huge chunks of himself in that razor wire. That being said, he managed to get over the fence and get away, and it would have looked like he was going to be gone and clear. 8 hours later, they found him in his mother's basement, his hands wrapped, crying, bleeding, almost unconscious from blood loss. He ended up losing the majority of his fingers. I don't know what that total number is, but it's more than 6. That's not a good thing. So again, that's really the ugliest escape attempt because it was clearly out of desperation. Like, if he had thought this out or planned it, but in that moment, he was just so emotional. He was going to take his chance. He thought he saw it, not realizing the ultimate cost he would pay, because not only did he lose the majority of his fingers, he was now going to spend 5 more years in prison for the choices he had made. The strangely uplifting story didn't start in any good kind of way. We had a lot of older guys in prison, and they usually had nothing to live for. They usually were not in a good place. Now, some were. Some were kind of like spiritual leaders or were tutors or had things going on. But you saw these other guys who were just kind of slowly dying and just like giving up. And that's usually what would happen is they would give up and then they would end up dying. And this guy, he walked around on his cane. So one day he went out on the rec yard and he went and he hit the small fence like he was going to climb it. Just in front of everybody, not surreptitiously, just like started trying to climb and barely got a foot off the ground. I mean, this guy had trouble walking. He was not in any kind of shape. He was very old. He's trying to do that and he's kind of like dangling his feet. He fell and he kind of did it again. And we could see the guy in the tower like on the radio. We're like, oh no, that's going to happen. Because anything like this, what they're supposed to do by policy is send out the goon squad to tackle this guy and rough him up and throw him in handcuffs and take him to the hole. Instead, this one sergeant, it was one of the sergeants that I really liked, kind of slowly and nicely and politely just kind of wandered down the path in no rush whatsoever, got down there, put his hand on this guy's shoulder who was back once again, like trying to climb the fence, and said, hey man, let's get you inside, let's get you to mental health. Like, you look tired, let's go. And we were all just shocked because again, we had seen such violent responses. Remember one guy in the throes of a mental health breakdown, they had sent him in and he had just basically been roughed up and they grabbed him and they were carrying him spread eagle down the stairs and his pants had come down. So he's being like held between all these people. He's struggling, his pants are down, he's embarrassed. And that was the typical like kind of goon squad response. And I think the thing that was so significant was, first of all, this sergeant was a really exceptional guy. And 2, it was just him. I mean, so often the individual would have done the good thing or the right thing, but once they were in a group, there was this kind of mob mentality. And that went both for incarcerated people as well as for the people that worked there. Because he was just polite and understood, hey man, this old man is probably trying to get us to shoot him. He's probably just trying to end it all and he doesn't have the courage to do it himself. Like, he's hurting, let's get him some help. I remember thinking like, God, if we responded to everything that way as like, let's understand what's happening here rather than using like violence, because it's ironic that we literally stick people in prison who use violence to solve problems, and then in prison use violence to solve problems. It seems to reinforce the wrong behavior. As far as my own experience with escaping from prison, the first major prison was Nottoway Correctional Center, and I had this friend or this mentor, this person in my life, and he shared a story with me. This was 30 years into his bid, where he was a tutor, used Shakespeare to teach people so they would get their GEDs. He was just a really exceptional guy. And he said, Jesse, you need to figure out how to escape from this place. You've got too long a sentence. And I thought he was saying, I really needed to go. So I said, okay, well, tell me, like, you've been here, why didn't you? He said, no, I figured it out a long time ago. I got mine. His point was, he said, you need to figure out a way to escape. Plan it down to every detail, take a week, take a month, take 6 months, and then every day you spend here, you spend by choice. You are not trapped. You are not being held here against your will. You could get out of here if you wanted. So every day you're here, you are here by your own choice. And so I took his advice. It probably took me about 3 months, but I looked, I counted, I measured, I did everything I possibly could, and I found a way that I could have gotten out. I could time the count, I could time the people, I knew exactly how I would do it. And I remember the day I went to test it. I wasn't going to actually break out. I wanted to see, could I make this work? A to B to C to D. And the moment they cleared count and they didn't find that somebody would have been missing, the moment I realized it would have worked, it shifted my mentality. Because I realized I really and truly was there by choice. Now, I would have been terrified. Who knows if it would have worked that day. It wasn't perfect, but it shifted the way I saw the world. And so often we can't change our circumstances, but we can change our perception of them or our role in them. It was like when I got shipped to the dormitory and I'm in the most horrendous circumstances possible and I felt like a victim. I felt like the locus of control was outside of me and I hated it. And somebody told me, you may not be able to control the story, but you can control the arc of the story. You can control how you tell it. And so I shifted. I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to be a victim here. I'm not going to complain. I'm going to teach classes. I'm going to find an opportunity. I'm going to get in better shape than I've ever been in. Like, what are the things in this environment that I can control and that I can use to my advantage? And that was my experience with escaping from prison, because knowing that I had that plan, knowing that I had that option, shifted where I was and shifted the sense of control. Because no longer these people are holding me here. It's I am choosing to stay here day after day, and I'm going to make the best of it.